was Francesca Battistelli with the breakup song, Breaking Up From Fear, here on 94.9. It is 4:15, and of course it's that time of day on a Tuesday for Creation Ministries International. Hey, if you've got any questions, we've got Mr. Mark James in New Zealand on the line at the moment. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon, or good evening. How are you, mate?
It's evening for you. It's sort of still afternoon for us. Hey, look, if you've got any questions for Mark James while we're speaking, please send those questions through to our text line. Just SMS 0401 949 949. Now, Mark, great to have you back on again. Of course, we had a great chat last week. And I remember mentioning to you early last week that I had a question about an article that I saw that you'd written on creation.com. And I found it a very interesting article. And I noticed in that article that Sir David Attenborough, you had a quote there, that he had said humans are a plague on Earth. That's an interesting article to write about.
Yeah, well, if you're watching the news, if you're listening to radio, if you're on the internet, you couldn't be blamed for thinking that we humans are just a plague on Earth. Basically, we get blamed for things like, 30, 40 years ago it was global cooling. Now it's global warming or climate change. There are famines. There are mass extinctions of animals going on around the world. There are plagues, deforestation, landslides, earthquakes, and much, much more. Yep. And it all seems to be being blamed on us human beings. Yes. We're the problem everywhere we go. Mm-hmm. And as you say, David Attenborough, the naturalist, you know what? He's just turned 99, I think, Mike.
Yes.
Just turned 99.
Yes, he's got an amazing voice. That's why people listen to him.
Oh, yes. But the programs he produces are beautiful. They really are.
Look, the guys with the cameras do such an amazing job. They zoom in on animals and birds and stuff, and you can see the tiniest little things. I mean, they really do look so cool. Yes.
And sadly, David Attenborough just looks at it all and says, well, it must all have happened through evolution and millions of years. There is no God. And we pray for David Attenborough a lot. In fact, we had a gentleman who worked for us by the name of Russell Gregg. I don't know if did you ever talk to Russell Gregg?
I don't know. I've been here too long.
Okay. He was basically the same age as David Attenborough. Mm-hmm. And Russell Gregg, he retired when he hit 66 or 67, and he moved all the way across the country to work for Creation Ministries. He basically came into the office free of charge, and he actually died at 90, just before his 98th birthday. He was working in the office 2 days before he died. He had a fall, he went into hospital, and he passed on to glory. But he actually contacted David Attenborough, and was witnessing to David Attenborough. And David Attenborough, because they were the same age, and apparently Queen Elizabeth was the same age as them as well.
Oh, wow.
And so David Attenborough and Russell Gregg had these incredible conversations backwards and forwards through emails. And all the way through, Russell was witnessing to David Attenborough. Wow. And when Queen Elizabeth passed away, the first thing that Russell did said, well, we've gone down from 3 to 2 now. Yes. So it's just you and me left, David. And now it's David's left. So our office, we pray for people like David Attenborough all the time.
Yeah.
But
cool.
I'd have to ask the question of someone like David Attenborough, if naturalistic evolution is true, why does it matter that we're a plague on Earth? Because if you think about it, if evolution is true, then we're nothing more than a highly evolved primate. We've come from an ape-like ancestor over millions of years. Yep. We're the result of mutations, random mutations, and natural selection. In other words, we are just another part of nature.
Yep.
Which means that anything we do is simply, according to the evolutionary worldview, anything we do is simply nature in action. So if a species becomes extinct because of our intervention, it's just natural selection, survival of the fittest. Yeah. If burning of the fossil fuels causes climate change, then it's really under this worldview, just a natural occurrence.
Yeah.
In fact, if you think about it, if the atheistic evolutionary worldview is true, everything is natural, which means the word unnatural can actually have no meaning.
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah, and but the interesting thing is that these people, they say these things, they blame us for everything, but they don't actually make the link. They don't realize that their worldview basically says we can have no meaning, so anything we do, it is just nature in action.
Yeah, and I mean, it's like they're saying, we're tearing this world apart, and we've taken billions and billions of years to evolve to tear the world apart. It kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it is. Exactly. And I was over in Australia a few years ago, and I know, how did it start? We were having this conversation. I went on a trip out to the Barrier Reef, and people on the boat were having this conversation about how human beings had evolved to the point where we were effectively we're going to destroy everything and stop evolution. And again, people say these things, but they just don't make the link. They don't realize that what they're saying is we do have purpose, and we're misusing that purpose.
Yep.
But where does that purpose come from? They don't make that link.
Yeah. And of course, we've heard many times, that our DNA is falling apart. It was so much better generations and generations ago. So it's so hard for us to believe that we're evolving if we're quite literally falling apart.
Yeah, but again, the evolutionists, the naturalists, they look at that and they don't want to talk about it, to be honest. The science tells us that everything is getting worse, not getting better. That there is no increasing information in DNA. If anything, DNA information is decreasing from generation to generation. Yep. Exactly the opposite of what evolution would tell us. But the interesting thing is that the environmentalists in particular, and David Attenborough I would include as an environmentalist, they like to tell us that we should leave the planet in better shape than we found it, or similar to that. Yeah. In fact, again, David Attenborough said, surely we have a responsibility to leave for future generations a planet that is healthy, inhabitable by all species. Mm-hmm. And again, this doesn't make sense. And in fact, these are really admirable intentions. And, yes. And I believe, I adhere to those sorts of intentions. We have dominion over creation. So we should be looking to leave it in as good a condition as we possibly can.
Yes.
But it's not what we'd expect if this evolutionary narrative was true. Richard Dawkins, he actually makes it very clear in his book, The Blind Watchmaker. He says, natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin discovered and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, this evolution, natural selection, has no purpose in mind. It has no mind's eye, no mind's eye. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. But somehow these blind, purposeless natural processes have managed to produce us human beings that have foresight. Okay, evolution doesn't have foresight, but it's produced us that do have foresight. It does not make sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. We're fortunate that we have a creator, but it's sad for so many people that believe in evolution because, well, they're not really following real science.
They're not. They talk about creationists and people like us. We're using the God of the gaps. If you can't explain it by science, then we just say God did it. Yep. But really, what we're seeing is these people are using evolution of the gaps. They can't explain it, so they just say, "Oh, evolution did it," and we'll work it out one day. One day we'll be able to work it out. But if we were to use the same argument, we get pillory. We really do.
Yeah, well, the further we go into science, the better microscopes we get and that sort of thing, the more they seem to agree with the Bible, and not the other way around. They don't sort of paint an evolutionary picture. So interesting. So many people are believing that.
Yep, absolutely. And the interesting thing is that this whole issue of us being given purpose through this evolutionary narrative. We have purpose. They don't know where it comes from, but they're putting this purpose onto us, even though they don't know where it's come from.
Yeah.
But it really, with us human beings, that's where it really, it really doesn't make sense, because evolution, environmentalists, they work tirelessly to save animals from extinction. Animals such as lions and tigers that compete for food with us. Animals that, given half a chance, would drive us to extinction.
Yeah.
Why, in an evolutionary narrative, would we do that? Why would we keep these things alive that might risk our own survival? It doesn't make sense. And in the article, I make the comment that Tennyson had this quote about nature red in tooth and claw. But apparently that red in tooth and claw doesn't apply if the tooth is brushed twice daily and the claws are occasionally painted. These things, according to these evolutionists and according to these environmentalists, don't apply to us humans. They apply to everything else in nature, don't apply to us humans.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like the Bible tells us that these people know that God exists. But they just do not want to admit it. They do not want to submit themselves to the God who created them.
Absolutely.
It's very sad.
Look, we're going to have to go into a little break right now, and we'll come back to Mr. Mark James, who's in New Zealand right now, sort of after this break. If you do have any questions for Mark, please send them through to our text line, 0401 949 949. And, let's just jump straight in because I've sort of pushed the traffic report a little bit off. We're going to jump straight into speaking with our very special guest from Creation Ministries, Mark James. And Mark, we were having a bit of a cool talk earlier in regards to evolution versus human behaviour. Yeah,
and we were talking about how it doesn't make sense from an evolutionary perspective it's even things like environmentalism, looking after creation, those sorts of things really don't make sense from an evolutionary perspective. But where it gets really interesting is in our human behavior and how we deal with other humans. Mm-hmm. And this is where the evolutionary disconnect becomes very obvious. We do things like we care for sick people. Now, that's a wonderful thing to do, but from an evolutionary perspective, why would we care for sick people? Because to start with, these sick people, they may well be genetically inferior individuals, mm-hmm. and we're allowing them to survive, which means they're using up resources, and we're also allowing them to reproduce, which means they're going to pass on this potentially inferior genetics, which would reduce the population fitness. Yes. We do things like we medically intervene to help infertile couples to reproduce and pass on their genes. But if they can't have babies, does that mean that their genes are a little bit inferior? Why are we helping people to pass on inferior genes? And at the same time, healthy individuals will use contraception to reduce the number of offspring that they have, and will often even undergo medical procedures to abort the offspring they've already conceived. Yeah. It just doesn't make sense from from the evolutionary perspective. We're here to pass on our genes.
Yeah.
Why would we, if there's a baby on the way, would we stop that baby arriving in the world? From an evolutionary perspective, it just doesn't make sense.
And of course, from a creation perspective, we're sort of doing what the Bible has been telling us to do regardless. We're loving everyone. We're trying to help people. Medicine is offered to, most people. I won't say everybody because there's sort of enclaves or areas where you just can't get to medical supplies. But, we're doing things in the opposite way, aren't we?
We very much are. And it's also in the lifestyles we choose. I mean, we will limit our likelihood of having children. I mean, with things like celibacy, people choose celibacy, same-sex relations, or some couples just choose never to have children. Again, why, if evolution is true, why would a couple choose to not have children?
Yeah.
We encourage young people to delay sexual activity, but from an evolutionary perspective, as soon as someone is sexually reached maturity, then they should be having children, because that would mean that the population will increase and that the evolution will continue. We have things like legislation which limits the number of sexual partners people can have. I mean, polygamy is outlawed, and even marriage itself limits the people to one partner. All those sorts of things, they don't make sense from an evolutionary perspective, but they do make sense from a biblical perspective. If we are created in the image of God, there are laws that God has put in place for us, and all these things do make sense if that is the world that we live in. But try and tell an evolutionist that, and they will rail against it wherever they possibly can.
Yeah, although you speak to somebody who professes to have no faith, and quite often they'll tell you, oh no, the reason why they do something is because it just feels right inside. I don't think they get that that's a spiritual thing. There's something inside them telling them that that's right, whereas they're just saying, no, it just feels right. Interesting how that works.
The fascinating thing is that evolutionists, they will always come up with an explanation for the behavior that they see around them. But even the explanations they have, they're very contradictory in nature. And basically, they reinforce the absurdity of evolution as being scientifically plausible. And there's a really great quote here from a guy by the name of Philip Skell, who's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And what he says is, natural selection makes humans self-centered and aggressive, except when it makes them altruistic and peaceable. Or natural selection produces virile men who eagerly spread their seed, except when it prefers men who are faithful protectors and providers. And then he says, and this is the National Academy of Sciences, he says, when an explanation is so supple that it can explain any behavior, it's difficult to test it experimentally, much less use it as a catalyst for scientific discovery. And that nails it. But that comes from somebody who is not a biblical creationist.
Yeah, wow.
And we have a book called Evolutionists Say the Oddest Things, and that is an odd thing for an evolutionist to say, definitely.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we say the same thing in science. You know, the oddest thing seems to point to profess to the Bible being correct so often. But, there's so many people that don't want to believe that. And, well, of course, we try to put labels on that as well. We say it's because they know that then they'll have to live a better life or whatever reason. But in a lot of cases, I think it's people sort of skip around or are just completely over the whole the spiritual side of things simply because they want to believe that little voice in their head is their own. Sometimes people sort of think, oh, no, it must have been me that thought that because it was too cool. Instead of saying, hey, thank you, Lord.
There's an element of pride in all of this. I don't know if I've said this with you before, Mick, but pride is a huge stumbling block. I mean, if you think about it, and you know what? I was an atheist for a long, long time. I was an atheist, Mick. And I have had to admit that all that time when I was an atheist, I had got everything completely wrong. And I had to swallow a huge amount of pride to accept that. And I think pride is the biggest stumbling block for so many people. You know, if you've believed something for all of your life, it's going to be very, very difficult to swallow that pride and say, I was wrong. Yeah. And I always say this when people are, they talk about their family or friends or workmates who are resistant to the gospel message. And I say the best thing you can do is pray and pray against pride. Yep. Because once that pride is breached, once it comes down, people become more open to accepting things that they've ruled out in the past.
Yes, absolutely. Now, Mark James, you wrote the article, Evolution versus Human Behaviour, that we're speaking about this afternoon. And, of course, you can find that in creation.com. That's the Creation Ministries website that has thousands of articles, thousands of pages. And I recommend reading it and having a look at all the other articles. There's some amazing articles on there. Look, the end of another week. Mark James in New Zealand, thank you so much for the time that you've spent with us.
Mick, it's always a pleasure, and it's just started pouring down with rain over here as well, so we've got some pretty rubbish weather. I just pray that you guys get some better weather and that your traffic sorts itself out.
Oh, thank you so much. In fact, during our little talk this afternoon, numerous times, I could hear the thunder and lightning literally above the studio here. Just wondering if anybody else could hear what was going on. But, yeah, I'm glad it seemed to come through okay. I was looking at sort of the sound levels and I could see you speaking and me speaking, and I couldn't really see the thunder rumbling on the little meter. So I think that was good.
I couldn't hear any of it, Nick. So
good.
All right. Well, you have a very blessed day.
Yes, you too. Thank you so much, Mr. Mark James in New Zealand. You are on 94.9. It's 12 minutes to 5. We've got Sarah Reeves up now. Billboards on Sunset.